South Korea has reported 0 new domestic novel coronavirus cases for the first time since February. The country reported 4 new infections which were all imported. South Korea reported 1 new death, taking the total number of COVID-19 fatalities to 247. The total number of cases in the country is now 10,765. South Korean health authorities also confirmed that no local transmission occurred from a parliamentary election that was held earlier this month, where authorities took safety measures, including requiring voters to wear masks and plastic gloves when casting their vote. The polls witnessed a high voter turnout despite the pandemic. Over 29 million people came out to cast their ballot in the April 15th parliamentary elections. After grappling with the first major outbreak outside of China, South Korea has largely managed to bring the outbreak under control without major disruptions and with a massive testing campaign and intensive contact tracing. And now we have our correspondent Bruce Harrison joining us live from South Korea's capital, Seoul. Bruce, talk to us. You saw South Korea first setting an example in terms of extensive testing, but it's now setting a larger example of containing this pandemic without resorting to too many restrictions.
Exactly. This is an incredible development. You mentioned 0 new infections domestically. There was a total of 4 cases in the previous 24 hours. Those happened to be reported from the quarantine station at the Incheon International Airport. So international arrivals, no new domestically transmitted cases. And a lot of what they've done beyond the contact tracing, as well as treating, quarantine, quickly putting into quarantine of those positive patients, has been a vast and social distancing campaign. The government has reached out through different telecommunications providers here to send the public regular updates on where cases of the disease have popped up, reminders about social distancing practices, hygiene, mask wearing. It's in your face over here. You're constantly reminded about what you can do to make sure this virus doesn't spread further. It's really been a community effort, and the people here seem to trust their government. This country learned from the MERS outbreak. It learned to test quickly and test often here when it came to COVID-19, and the public health care system has been supporting the fight, and the people have a lot of trust in it. So they're listening to the government when it tells them what to do about how to prevent the spread, and I think that's been a big part of the success here.
Bruce, there were questions when South Korea chose to hold its parliamentary elections smack in the middle of the pandemic, and now the government has confirmed that no transmission took place even as those elections witnessed a record turnout of 29 million people coming out to vote.
An incredible turnout, and the government took serious precautions when it came to this election. For one thing, they held early voting so they could try and thin the numbers at polling stations on the actual election day. It seems that's proved successful. At the polls themselves, where I visited multiple times, people had to first have their temperature taken before they could enter the polling station. They then had to sanitize their hands. They then had to put on plastic or rubber gloves before they could receive their ballot and then vote. It seems these steps did a good job at preventing the spread of the virus, and ultimately fears about the election spreading COVID-19 have not come out to be true.
Bruce, also talk to us in terms of what are the restrictions that South Korea has in place. We're also trying to understand, in terms of what is South Korea's model, because it has relied on mass testing and contact tracing to contain the pandemic rather than stricter lockdown measures.
Exactly. They've avoided lockdowns and have had massive success without doing so, compared to a lot of countries that went quickly into a lockdown scenario. South Korea did start to step up its quarantine measures as soon as it became apparent there was cluster infections outside of the hardest hit area in the southeast of the country. They began requiring all international arrivals to receive a temperature check as well as a COVID-19 test at the airports. If you tested positive, you were put into quarantine on site and then moved to an area, hospital or clinic for treatment. If you didn't test positive, you were required to quarantine, self-isolate for 2 weeks. And those that broke those self-isolation periods, that were discovered breaking them, some of those people were then required to wear tracking bracelets. But overall, there hasn't been much enforcement by the government. If you were in Korea before those measures took place for international arrivals, you were able to travel freely. The government encouraged people not to go out unless they needed to. But we've seen as the weather warmed that more and more people have been venturing out, going to crowded areas, but they're wearing their masks, they're practicing social distancing. And I think those two things are huge in preventing the spread. This country is an example of how that can work. Though there are still fears of a second wave or another outbreak, the government's trying to encourage social distancing to this day to make sure that doesn't happen.
Bruce Harrison joining us with that ground report straight from Seoul. Thank you, Bruce, for being with us here on the broadcast.